A backpacker found a phone ringing in the middle of the woods with no one around for miles. Everyone said it was probably just a lost device, but when she answered the call and heard what was on the other end, she realized this phone was connected to a mystery that would expose secrets people had killed to protect. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what's the strangest thing you've ever found while hiking. The Adirondack Mountains sprawled across northern New York like a forgotten kingdom, 6 million acres of pristine wilderness where civilization felt like a distant memory. Ancient peaks crowned with mist rose from valleys thick with hemlock and white pine, and somewhere within this vast expanse, 29-year-old Zara Blackwood had found the silence she desperately needed. Zara had been running from more than just her problems when she'd left Boston 3 months ago. A former emergency room nurse who'd watched too many people die during the pandemic, she'd reached a breaking point that therapy and medication couldn't touch. The nightmares had started first, then the panic attacks, then the inability to sleep without seeing the faces of patients she couldn't save. Her supervisor had called it compassion fatigue. Zara called it drowning. So she'd done what felt impossible but necessary. She'd walked away from everything. Her apartment lease, her job, her relationship with David, who'd never understood why she couldn't just get over it, and return to normal. She'd sold her car, bought professional hiking gear, and disappeared into the wilderness like a ghost seeking redemption in solitude. The trail she'd been following for the past week didn't appear on any official maps. She discovered it by accident, following what looked like an old logging road that gradually narrowed into a footpath, then into something that might have been carved by deer rather than humans. It wound through some of the most remote sections of the High Peaks wilderness, threading between mountains with names like Algonquin and Wright that few people ever bothered to climb. Her backpack contained everything she needed for extended solitude: a ultralight tent that weighed less than 2 pounds, a water filtration system, freeze-dried meals for 2 weeks, and most importantly, no way to contact the outside world. She'd deliberately left her phone in Boston. Out here, time moved differently. Days were measured by the sun's arc across the sky, by the distance her boots could carry her before darkness fell, by the gradual healing that came with each mile away from the noise of modern life. Zara had grown up in these mountains. Her grandmother, Elena Blackwood, had been a forest ranger here for 30 years before retiring to a cabin on Saranac Lake. Some of Zara's earliest memories involved following Elena through these same woods, learning to read animal tracks, to identify edible plants, to navigate by compass when the trail disappeared. Those skills had saved her life more than once during her solo journey. The morning she found the phone, October mist hung between the trees like spider webs made of light. She'd camped beside a beaver pond that reflected the surrounding peaks like a dark mirror, 15 miles from the nearest maintained trail. According to her topographical map, she was at least 40 miles from the nearest road, 60 from the nearest town. She'd seen no other hikers for 8 days, no aircraft overhead, no sign that the modern world existed beyond these ancient forests. She was breaking down her campsite when she first heard it. A faint electronic chirping that cut through the morning stillness like a blade. The sound was so out of place that she froze, her sleeping bag half stuffed into its compression sack, listening to make sure she wasn't imagining things. The sound came again. Electronic, insistent, completely impossible in a place where her own emergency beacon couldn't reach a satellite through the thick canopy overhead. Zara had spent enough time in the wilderness to trust her instincts, and every instinct was screaming that something was wrong. In 3 months of solo hiking, she developed an almost supernatural awareness of her surroundings. She could identify the difference between a squirrel moving through leaves and a human footstep. She knew which bird calls belonged in which habitats. And she knew that electronic sounds had no place in the deep wilderness. The chirping continued, regular and mechanical. Following the sound, she pushed through a stand of young birches, their white bark ghostly in the morning light. The noise grew louder as she moved away from the pond, leading her up a gentle slope covered in moss and fallen logs. Ancient hemlocks towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked most of the sky. Then she saw it. A smartphone lying face down on a carpet of emerald moss, its screen lighting up with each ring. The device looked like it had been placed there moments ago, pristine and clean despite the dampness that permeated everything in these woods. Stranger still, When she pulled out her emergency GPS device to check, it showed no signal, no connection to the outside world. Yet this phone was clearly receiving calls. Zara's nursing background had taught her to assess situations methodically, to look for details others might miss. She circled the phone without touching it, studying the scene like a crime investigator. The moss around the device was completely undisturbed. No footprints led to or from the spot. No broken branches suggested someone had pushed through the undergrowth. The phone sat there like it had materialized from thin air, a piece of 21st century technology in a landscape that had remained unchanged for centuries. She knelt down, examining the ground more carefully. In the soft earth between the moss patches, she should have seen some sign of human passage. A boot print, a scuffed rock, a bent fern. Nothing. The forest floor was as pristine as if no human had walked here since the last ice age. The phone rang again, and Zara jumped despite herself. The sound was unnaturally loud in the forest quiet, echoing off the tree trunks like a gunshot. She checked her own emergency device again, confirmed what she already knew. No signal, no service, no possible way for any phone to connect to cellular networks from this location. Yet this stranger's phone kept ringing. Zara had always been methodical, analytical. Her medical training demanded explanations for impossible things. During her years in emergency medicine, she'd learned to stay calm in chaotic situations, to think clearly when others panicked. This phone was just another puzzle that needed solving, another patient presenting with symptoms that didn't make sense. She mentally cataloged the possibilities. Satellite phones existed, but this looked like a standard iPhone, sleek and modern with what appeared to be a simple black case. She'd heard of hidden cell towers, but she'd been studying topographical maps of this region for months and knew every structure within 50 miles. There were no towers, no repeaters, no infrastructure of any kind that could explain how this device was receiving calls. The phone fell silent for 30 seconds, then immediately began ringing again. Whoever was calling wasn't giving up. The persistence itself was disturbing. Who called someone this relentlessly? And how did they know the phone would be answered in a place where no phone should work? She stood up, backing away a few steps to study the scene from a different angle. The hemlock grove was ancient, some of the trees easily 300 years old. Their massive trunks were scarred with the marks of decades of storms, their lower branches heavy with moss. This was old-growth forest, the kind that existed before European settlement, the kind her grandmother had spent her career protecting. The phone screen lit up again, casting a blue glow on the surrounding moss. In that brief illumination, Zara noticed something she'd missed before, a faint trail leading away from the phone's location, barely visible unless you knew how to look. It wasn't a game trail or a natural path worn by water runoff. It was too straight, too deliberate. Someone had walked here recently, but had been careful to minimize their impact. The ringing stopped. Started again. The caller wasn't giving up. Zara's curiosity finally overcame her caution. She'd spent 3 months running from the world, but she'd also spent years solving medical mysteries, diagnosing conditions that presented with impossible symptoms. This phone was just another diagnostic challenge, another system that shouldn't work but somehow did. Act 3. First contact, 300 words. She crouched beside the device, studying it more closely without touching it. The case was unmarked, no stickers or scratches that might indicate its owner. The screen showed an incoming call from a number with a 518 area code, Albany, New York, local to this region, but that made the situation even more impossible. She was days from the nearest cell tower. The ringing stopped. Started again. Stopped. Started again. Zara's medical training had taught her to gather information before making decisions, but it had also taught her when quick action was necessary. This phone was an anomaly that needed investigation. She needed to understand how this was possible. She picked up the device. It was warm, as if someone had just been holding it. The warmth traveled up her fingers like an electric current. The screen showed the incoming call clearly. Unknown number, duration 23 seconds, and counting. Her thumb hovered over the answer button. Every survival instinct told her to drop the phone and hike back towards civilization as fast as possible. To pack her gear and put as much distance as possible between herself and this impossible situation. But her nurse's mind, trained to diagnose and solve problems, won the internal battle. Zara swiped to answer the call. "Hello," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Silence. Then breathing, slow and labored, like someone who'd been running or was very afraid. "Hello?" she repeated, louder this time. "I can hear you breathing. Who is this?" The breathing continued for several long seconds. Then, a voice. Female, young, speaking in a whisper filled with desperation. "Thank God. I've been trying to reach someone for days. They took my sister, and they're going to kill her if I don't." The line went dead. Zara stared at the phone, her medical training immediately cataloging what she'd heard. The voice had been real, human, terrified. Not a prank or a wrong number, but someone in genuine distress. The caller had mentioned a kidnapping, a threat, days of trying to reach help. She tried to call back, but the phone showed no signal. When she pressed the power button, the screen remained black. The device was completely dead, as if that single call had drained every ounce of power from its battery. But that was impossible. Phones didn't work that way. Nothing about this situation followed any logical rules she understood. The forest around her seemed different now. The morning mist had thickened, making the trees appear to shift and move in her peripheral vision. The silence felt heavier, pregnant with secrets. Even the beaver pond behind her seemed to reflect the sky differently, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath. Zara turned the phone over in her hands, looking for any identifying marks, any clue about its origin or purpose. The back was smooth, unmarked. No serial numbers, no carrier information, nothing that might help her understand what had just happened. But someone had just called for help. Someone whose sister had been kidnapped. Someone who'd been trying for days to reach anyone who might be able to help. And somehow, that call had reached her in the deepest wilderness, through technology that shouldn't work, carrying a message that made her blood run cold. Cliffhanger ending. As Zara stood there holding the dead phone, she began to notice other things that didn't belong in this ancient forest. The faint trail she'd spotted earlier led deeper into the woods, but now she could see that it was more than just a footpath. There were subtle signs of recent activity. A broken branch at exactly shoulder height, disturbed moss that formed an almost perfect line, and most disturbing of all, the barely audible hum of machinery somewhere in the distance. The phone hadn't been lost or dropped by accident. It had been placed there deliberately, a beacon designed to lure someone into the wilderness. And as the morning mist swirled around her, Zara realized that whoever had taken that girl's sister might still be watching, waiting to see who would answer their trap. What was hidden so deep in the Adirondack wilderness that someone would use a desperate phone call as bait? Subscribe and hit the bell. Part 2 reveals the shocking truth Zara discovers when she follows that hidden trail, and the danger she finds will test every survival skill she's ever learned. The morning mist thickened as Zara studied the faint trail leading away from where she'd found the phone. Her grandmother Elena had taught her to read the forest like a book, and this story was written in broken twigs, compressed moss, and the subtle signs most people would never notice. Someone had walked this path recently, but they'd been careful to minimize their impact. Zara's medical training warred with her survival instincts. The nurse in her couldn't ignore a cry for help, couldn't walk away from someone whose sister had been kidnapped. But the hiker who'd spent 3 months alone in the wilderness knew that following mysterious trails in remote locations was exactly how people disappeared forever. She packed her gear methodically, stuffing the dead phone into her jacket pocket despite its uselessness. The device felt heavier than it should, like it was carrying the weight of that desperate voice. "They took my sister." The words echoed in her mind as she shouldered her backpack and began following the barely visible path. The trail wound through increasingly dense forest, threading between massive hemlock trunks that blocked most of the morning light. Ancient trees that had stood here when her great-great-grandmother was young rose like cathedral pillars around her. The air grew colder as she climbed, thick with the scent of moss and decay that marked old-growth wilderness. After an hour of careful walking, Zara began to notice that the forest was too quiet. No birdsong echoed through the trees. No squirrels chattered in the branches overhead. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath. In her months of solo hiking, she'd learned that unnatural silence usually meant one of two things: a predator was nearby, or humans had disturbed the natural order. The trail gradually became more obvious, less concerned with hiding its presence. Boot prints appeared in soft patches of earth, deep enough to suggest someone carrying heavy equipment. Broken branches showed where packs or gear had brushed against the undergrowth. Most disturbing of all, she began to see tire tracks in the muddy sections of the path. Tire tracks, 40 miles from the nearest road. Zara knelt beside one of the clearer impressions, using skills her grandmother had taught her decades ago. The tread pattern was deep and aggressive, the kind used on ATVs or military vehicles designed for rough terrain. The tracks were fresh, maybe a day old. Someone with serious off-road equipment had been using this trail recently. The sound of machinery she'd noticed earlier grew louder as she climbed higher into the mountains. It wasn't the natural noise of wind through trees or water flowing over rocks. This was mechanical, industrial, completely out of place in protected wilderness. The humming was accompanied by periodic metallic clanging, like construction equipment operating somewhere ahead. As the trail crested a small ridge, Zara caught her first glimpse of what lay hidden in the remote valley beyond. Through a gap in the trees, she could see a cluster of temporary buildings, their metal roofs glinting in the filtered sunlight. Vehicles were parked in neat rows beside the structures. Generator units hummed quietly, providing power to whatever operation was running in this supposedly pristine wilderness. She dropped low, using the thick undergrowth to conceal her approach. Her medical training had taught her to observe carefully before acting, and what she was observing made no sense. This was protected federal wilderness, land where even hiking required permits and camping was restricted to designated areas. Yet someone had established what looked like a full-scale industrial operation in one of the most remote valleys in the Adirondacks. Moving closer, staying behind the cover of ancient trees, Zara began to see the scope of what was hidden here. The temporary buildings were larger than they'd appeared from a distance, connected by boardwalks that kept foot traffic off the forest floor. Solar panels had been discreetly positioned to catch sunlight filtering through the canopy. This wasn't a temporary camp or research station. It was a permanent installation designed to operate without detection. From her concealed position behind a massive white pine, Zara could see people moving between the buildings. They wore dark clothing and moved with military precision, carrying equipment she couldn't identify from this distance. Whatever was happening here required serious security and sophisticated planning. Her phone from Boston would have been useless here even if she'd brought it, but she still felt the absence of any way to contact the outside world. She was witnessing something that clearly violated federal law, something that people had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide, and she had no way to report it or call for help. The metallic clanging she'd been hearing came from the largest of the temporary structures. Through its open doors, she could see industrial equipment that looked completely out of place in a wilderness setting. Drilling machinery, computer monitors, cases of specialized gear she couldn't identify. This wasn't logging or mining, both of which would be illegal here anyway. This looked like some kind of research or extraction operation that required serious technological support. A movement near the smaller buildings caught her attention. Two figures emerged from what looked like a bunkhouse, one of them clearly a guard carrying what appeared to be an assault rifle. The sight of military-grade weapons in a place where hunting was prohibited sent ice through Zara's veins. Whatever was happening here, the people involved were willing to use force to protect it. Then she saw her, a young woman, maybe 20 years old, being escorted between buildings by two guards. Even from a distance, Zara could see that the woman's hands were restrained behind her back. The way she stumbled suggested she was either injured or drugged. This wasn't an employee or researcher. This was a prisoner. The sister. The kidnapped sister from the phone call. Zara's medical training kicked in automatically, assessing what she could see of the prisoner's condition. The woman appeared conscious but unsteady, requiring support from her guards to walk. Possible head injury, drug effects, or extreme exhaustion. Without being able to examine her directly, Zara couldn't determine the extent of whatever medical issues she was facing. More disturbing was the realization that if this woman was here, her sister, the one who'd made the desperate phone call, was probably here too, either as another prisoner or worse. Staying low, Zara worked her way around the perimeter of the installation, cataloging what she could see. The operation was more extensive than it had first appeared. Additional buildings were hidden deeper in the trees, connected by paths that had been carefully camouflaged from aerial detection. Generator units provided power to what looked like a sophisticated communication setup, with satellite dishes and transmission equipment that explained how a phone could work in this remote location. Near the communication center, she spotted something that made her blood run cold. A large pit had been excavated behind one of the buildings, surrounded by warning signs and covered with a heavy tarp. The disturbed earth around it suggested recent digging, and the chemical smell drifting from the area made her think of industrial waste or something far worse. Movement near the pit caught her attention. 3 men in hazmat suits were checking monitoring equipment positioned around the excavation. Whatever they'd buried or were extracting from that hole required serious environmental precautions. This wasn't just kidnapping. This was some kind of illegal dumping or extraction operation that posed serious environmental threats to the surrounding wilderness. As she watched, one of the hazmat-suited figures removed his helmet, revealing a face she recognized from news reports years ago. Dr. Marcus Webb, a former EPA scientist who'd been dismissed after being caught falsifying environmental impact reports for mining companies. He'd disappeared from public view after congressional hearings exposed his corruption, but here he was, apparently running some kind of illegal operation in protected wilderness. The pieces began falling into place in Zara's mind. Webb had been caught selling falsified environmental clearances to companies that wanted to extract resources from protected lands. His disappearance had ended the investigation, but he hadn't disappeared. He'd gone underground, literally. This installation was his way of continuing his work outside the reach of federal oversight. But what resources could be valuable enough to justify this level of risk and secrecy? And how did kidnapping fit into an environmental crime? Her question was answered when she overheard a conversation between Webb and another man near the communication center. They were discussing rare earth minerals, elements essential for manufacturing electronics, and renewable energy technology. The valley they'd chosen sat on top of one of the largest undeveloped deposits in North America, protected by federal wilderness designation but worth billions to anyone willing to extract it illegally. Webb had developed a method for extracting the minerals using techniques that would poison the groundwater for generations, techniques so toxic that no legitimate company would risk using them. But working in secret, with no oversight and no environmental protections, he could extract enough rare earth elements to make himself and his investors incredibly wealthy. The kidnapped women weren't random victims. As Zara listened to more of their conversation, she learned that one of them was Dr. Sarah Martinez, a geology professor who'd been researching rare earth deposits in the Adirondacks. Her sister Emma had been taken as leverage to force Sarah's cooperation in mapping the most valuable extraction sites. The phone call Zara had received wasn't random either. Webb's operation needed to test their communication equipment regularly, and they'd been using stolen phones to make calls that would appear legitimate to anyone monitoring cellular networks. Emma had managed to grab one of the test phones during a brief moment when her guards were distracted, using it to make a desperate call for help before being recaptured. Zara was witnessing more than kidnapping and illegal mining. This was environmental terrorism that would poison one of the country's most important watersheds. The chemicals Webb was using would contaminate streams that fed into major river systems, affecting drinking water for millions of people downstream. She had to get this information to authorities, but first she needed evidence. Using her phone's camera, which still worked even without cellular service, she began documenting everything she could see. The buildings, the equipment, the excavation site, the faces of Webb and his associates. Every photo could be crucial for federal investigators. Moving closer to get clearer shots, Zara accidentally stepped on a dry branch. The crack echoed through the quiet forest like a gunshot. Immediately, shouts erupted from the installation below. Guards began spreading out, searching for the source of the noise. She ran. 3 months of wilderness hiking had left her in the best physical condition of her life, and she used every skill her grandmother had taught her about moving quickly through dense forest. Behind her, she could hear men crashing through the undergrowth, their heavy equipment and unfamiliarity with the terrain working against them. Zara's route back to her original campsite took her through some of the most difficult terrain in the region, across streams and over ridges that would challenge even experienced hikers. Her pursuers fell further behind with each mile, their urban conditioning no match for someone who'd been living in the wilderness for months. When she finally reached her campsite by the beaver pond, Zara packed her essential gear and began the long hike toward civilization. She had 40 miles of rough terrain ahead of her, but she also had evidence of one of the most serious environmental crimes in decades. The investigation that followed Webb's arrest exposed a network of similar operations across the country, hidden installations where environmental criminals were extracting resources from protected lands using techniques so toxic they were banned worldwide. Zara's photos and testimony became the foundation for prosecutions that sent dozens of environmental terrorists to federal prison. The two sisters, Sarah and Emma Martinez, both survived their ordeal. Sarah's geological research was instrumental in helping environmental scientists understand the full scope of the damage Webb had planned, while Emma's courage in grabbing the test phone and calling for help had saved not just her own life, but potentially millions of others who would have been affected by the contaminated water. For Zara, the experience marked a turning point in her own healing journey. The nightmares from her nursing career began to fade, replaced by dreams of the forest and the knowledge that she'd helped save something precious and irreplaceable. She returned to Boston eventually, but not to the emergency room. Instead, she became an environmental investigator, using her medical training and wilderness skills to help protect places like the Adirondacks from those who would destroy them for profit. The phone that had started it all was never found. It had probably been destroyed when federal agents raided the installation. But sometimes, when Zara was alone in the wilderness, she imagined she could still hear it ringing somewhere in the distance, a reminder that even in the most remote places, someone might be calling for help. If this story inspired you to think about the hidden threats to our wild places, share it with someone who cares about protecting our environment. Subscribe for more stories of ordinary people who discover extraordinary courage when it matters most.